Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. The clock is ticking towards the midterm elections, but we continue to look beyond such transient things as elections into longer term. But elections have definite side effects or impact areas, and the Supreme Court has been one that was promised in 2016 and certainly has been borne out. So we begin now that the dust is settled on the Supreme Court nomination and nomination ugliness of now Justice Brett Kavanaugh with Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation and talk a little bit about the impact that Brett Kavanaugh's vote may have on the Supreme Court going forward. Hans, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, it's terrific to talk to you again.
Well, thanks so much. Again, I don't think this country has seen the level of acrimony that was on display in the Supreme Court nomination battle over Brett Kavanaugh. And I understand that there is a lot at stake, but is it being overplayed how much Brett Kavanaugh's vote in the Supreme Court will make in replacing Justice Kennedy?
Well, I think it was greatly overplayed by the left. I mean, the way they were talking, it was as if the sky would fall in if he got confirmed.
Yeah.
Look, the short way of summarizing the difference is that we have gone from having an inconsistent conservative in Justice Kennedy to, I think, a more consistent conservative with Judge Kavanaugh. And look, in the majority of cases, it's not going to make a difference. I mean, to give you a quick example of this, the last term of the Supreme Court was a very significant term. We had very important decisions on people not being able to be forced into unions. We had the court upholding the so-called travel ban that the president had put out. We had the Masterpiece Cake Shop case concerning a baker in Colorado being forced to bake a cake for a gay wedding. In all of those cases, 19 of them, as a matter of fact, there were five. These were all 5-4 decisions. There were 19 cases in the last term that were 5-4 decisions. In every single one of them, Justice Kennedy voted with the conservatives. So, if Brett Kavanaugh had been on the court, we would have seen exactly the same thing. The vast majority of cases, Justice Kennedy would agree with the conservatives, certainly on First Amendment issues, on Second Amendment issues. The places where he would side with the liberals were a small number of cases, often on issues that I would call politically correct issues. So, for example, as you know, he was the key fifth vote with the liberals on the case just a couple of years ago, recognizing gay marriage. In fact, he wrote the opinion, and he has sided with the liberals also sometimes in the past on things like capital punishment, on abortion issues, et cetera. So I think in those cases, the liberals are no longer going to have somebody who's going to side with them on those kind of issues.
Well, Hans, let me ask you then, because one of the things that was most puzzling about some of those rulings is that they seem to fall into what is colloquially referred to as legislating from the bench. And it's not that just the Supreme Court does it. Often the progressives will look at the lower courts as a way to get precedent and then push that up to a place where a Supreme Court either just won't take the case and hopefully have it come through. We see them judge shopping into the Ninth Circuit Court and things like that. Is that era perhaps going to be over? In some of Brett Kavanaugh's testimony, he talks about precedent and applying the Constitution as a yardstick. So it seemed like that legislating from the bench may be curtailed somewhat. What do you think?
Oh, no, I think you're exactly right. I think it is going to be curtailed somewhat. And that's why I call Kennedy an inconsistent conservative. Look, he was great in agreeing with the conservatives to recognize the actual rights in the Constitution, like the Second Amendment. But then he had a tendency, as he did in the gay marriage case, to create a non-existent constitutional right. I mean, that is legislating from the bench. And I don't think you're going to see Brett Kavanaugh doing that. The problem is that these days the Supreme Court only takes, Joe, about 80 cases a year.
Right.
I mean, there are literally thousands of cases in the federal courts that never get to the Supreme Court. They only get to the courts of appeal that make the final decisions on those cases. And that's why, it was really important to get Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. But the president also, has been really pushing to get vacancies filled on the dozen courts of appeal across the country. He's been very successful in doing that. And those posts are also important in stopping the legislating from the bench that's been going on in the lower courts.
Well, and you read my notes because I was leading up to getting into, perhaps even more impactful in the Trump legacy, if you'll call it that, is going to be a lot of these appointments to these, quote, lower courts where so much more, these are courts where every case is going to get heard. It's just that, the ability to protect our rights is going to be stronger in these courts, even in the Ninth Circuit Court. I've seen, opinions rendered there or rulings there that I was surprised in the last 3 or 4 months.
Well, yeah, and that's because, like I said, the president's been phenomenally successful, despite, by the way, a huge fight by Democrats to slow things down in the Senate. He's been very successful in getting conservative judges confirmed to those courts of appeal. I have to tell you, without any doubt in my mind, as a lawyer, and from what I've seen being in Washington all these years, that two things are true. Barack Obama, in his 8 years in office, appointed the most liberal, the most radical left-wing ideologues to the federal bench that we've ever had in our entire history. And on the other side of that, Donald Trump, I think, has been appointing some of the best, most conservative constitutionalists that we've ever had on the federal bench.
He's also done a very good job of pointing out where the foot dragging has been, that there is a constitutional protection to make sure there are speedy trials. And I can't recall any conservative presidents faced with obstructionist left bringing that up. And that is one of the most misunderstood parts of the Constitution, is that you can't just languish in jail for years on end waiting to have your case heard, or have your business hung in limbo waiting for a case to be heard. You're supposed to be, you're promised by our Constitution the right to a speedy and just trial.
Yeah, and that is really, really important, which is also another reason why it is really just unconscionable the way the Democrats have tried to do everything they can to slow down the confirmation of judges, particularly down at the lower courts and the district courts. Those are the trial level courts, and those are the courts in which people who are being prosecuted by the government, their cases are heard. And there are still a lot of vacancies and seats that need to be filled. And as I said, it's just unconscionable to prevent judges from getting into those positions.
If the continuation of the Trump agenda of getting these seats filled and getting these courts up to full, I know that one of the things that happens in these proceedings is what's called an en banc review. So right. if a particular progressive policy gets brought before the court and they don't like the 3 judges that are assigned to them, they'll turn around and then request the full review of the full circuit court. If these courts become more conservative as a rule, I have a feeling that those will also be curtailed, saving the taxpayer fortunes in court costs.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, the procedure is normally when you go to a federal court of appeal, a 3-judge panel is assigned to hear your case. Once that 3-judge panel issues a decision, whichever party lost can request that the entire court take it up. That's what we call en banc. And yes, as those courts hopefully get more conservative, I think liberals, when they lose before 3-judge panels, aren't going to want to appeal to the entire Court of Appeal, and they're not going to want to appeal to the Supreme Court either.
Hans von Spakovsky is the senior legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. On with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Hans, let's take the issue of legislating from the bench and turn it the other way, and why the left seems so interested in doing that. It seems, especially over the last 2 years, that a small portion of our population, and I'm still waiting for some demographers to tell me whether it's 5% or 10%, seem to be getting 90% of the news coverage, and therefore it seems like they are driving the popular narrative. But they also seem to be having an impact on our courts when even Justice Roberts voting in favor of the Affordable Care Act's constitutionality for ostensibly not wanting the street fight over it if they were to have ruled constitutionally that it had no place, that not doing something violated the Interstate Commerce Clause. So is this really something where the left, for all appropriate reasons, needs to go back to legislating the way they're supposed to, which is bring a bill forward, see who supports it, and then try to get that passed? Much has been made about Roe versus Wade. And one of the big problems in our country is that we've never legislated about abortion. We've just allowed the courts to make rulings about it. And maybe it's because the left doesn't believe they have enough votes to legislate constitutionally these things, but will we see perhaps the left go back to trying to make these things law the way they did with the Affordable Care Act, at least?
Well, they might if depending on what happens in the midterm elections. But look, you've actually put your finger on why, for example, Barack Obama put such a liberal judges into the federal courts. Look, the left is frankly, they're very anti-democratic. And what they've been doing now for decades is when they know that they can't convince state legislators or Congress, when they know they can't convince voters to go their way on particular social issues, particular laws they want, they have used the alternative venue of the courts to try to get that imposed by judicial fiat. And unfortunately, they've had very liberal judges who have helped them do that. But it is a very anti-democratic process. It's using the courts when they know they don't have support through the legislative process to get done what they want to get done. And I think they're going to continue to do that because while Donald Trump is filling vacancies on the court, there are still a lot of very liberal judges around the country. And we've seen that in the last 2 years in the kind of crazy decisions we've seen coming out of the courts on everything from the travel ban to sanctuary policies.
Is that a dangerous precedent, though? Because I feel like as they've pushed that agenda harder on the street, the citizens feel less and less like there's justice. And I wonder if the rhetoric they use to try to push judges into making decisions favorable to their policies is actually creating an environment where the vox populi is losing faith in the justice system. Oh,
I think that's very much happening. And look, you can see how much the public now understands how important judges are. If you look at the polling, remember after the 2016 election, it turned out that filling that seat on the U.S. Supreme Court, that was actually an important issue, according to the polling, to a lot of voters. I don't think that's ever happened in our history.
Yeah,
that voters were thinking about who was going to be on the Supreme Court.
Well, I can't recall a presidential candidate making as big a deal about it as Donald Trump did, and that's to the credit to his advisors, or perhaps he himself, came into it saying, "Hey, this is an important thing that the president is going to have to do. Let's let the voters know about it," because rarely does that kind of stuff get brought up, and usually it's brought up by somebody who's considered like a 1 or 2% candidate who's just bringing up some wonky points for folks like you and me, Hans, who get into this stuff. Right. Never does it become popularly discussed around barbecue pits.
No, and we just saw it again, and we may see that again because look, the polling from a couple of months ago showed Democrats rolling into big victories in these upcoming midterm elections all over the country. And the most recent polling over the past month shows a reversal of that, and it seems to be tied to the shameful spectacle that the Democrats created in going after Brett Kavanaugh with false charges and going after him personally, and that may have backfired very big on the Democrats. We'll see what happens in November, but I think they made a major mistake. And again, this upcoming election may have been affected by the Supreme Court.
Well, and you bring up a great point, and this was a survey, I forget the young lady's name, and I should remember it. She's been on the program that did the book on who was voting for Trump, and went out and sought out that 20% of Obama voters that voted for Trump. And so much of what they said was we were really incapable of voting for Hillary Clinton. And I'm seeing and sensing that in these poll numbers, Hans. Do you see that as well, where people start looking at these members of the House and or candidates for the House who are engaging in this political version of Me Too, and saying I can't support that. That's not what I'm looking for. And my innate sense of fairness as a human says that's just not what I want my congressional representative to do. So if anything, he's turned that same thing down into congressional races. Like, I can't vote for that person.
No, I think we are seeing that. I think the polling shows that, and I think the visual images that Americans saw of these screaming, rude, outrageous protesters during the Kavanaugh hearing, then they saw Senate Democrats and actually members of the House too encouraging and applauding that kind of behavior. And I think voters are looking at that going, we don't want people like that in Congress. The American public doesn't like that kind of behavior, and again, I think it's really hurt the Democratic push in this election.
As a parent, Hans, I know when my kids would throw a tantrum, it was because they wanted something, and in their mind, they wanted it very, very badly. Do you think that the American public is seeing the same thing in the American left, that these tantrums that they're throwing now? We had a case in our flagship city where an elementary school teacher, in an effort to get the Confederate flag banned from the hallways of a local school, kicked the police chief in the groin when they were being ejected from a meeting for disrupting it and actually stealing other people's First Amendment rights. Decided that kicking the police chief in the groin was the best way forward to it, and now is complaining that he's being targeted judicially for his activism rather than his actions of kicking a police officer, and never mind where, I guess, just kicking him in general. I mean, this behavior, this tantrum throwing, seems indicative to me of some deeper need to have substantive change in our American culture. How badly do they want it, and what are some of the things that they're looking for in this, Hans?
Well, look, all of these individuals on the left, they have this particular view of this progressive utopia they think America should be.
Medicaid for all, yeah.
And you can see that they really think that any tactics are worth achieving that goal, and you see that in behavior. I mean, look, we just, what was it, over the weekend? You saw outrageous violence in Portland by this Antifa movement, which seems to think that anything you do against conservatives and others who disagree with you is justified. And again, that is not the kind of civil behavior that Americans want to see.
Well, and it's mob rule. It's we'll break your stuff if you don't share your stuff or give us your stuff. How much worse do you think it's going to get, Hans, before it starts to turn back around and the majority of Americans, who I truly believe are a profound majority, win out the day? I mean, I worry that this midterm election, if it doesn't go the left's way, we're going to see a redoubling of these efforts.
No, I think it's going to get worse. And look, the Kavanaugh episode, I think, is really one of the lowest points, one of the most shameful points in the history of the U.S. Senate. But if Donald Trump gets the look, with Kavanaugh, like I said, we were replacing a justice who was mostly conservative with a conservative justice. If Donald Trump gets the opportunity to replace another member of the Supreme Court, a liberal member, you think it was bad this time? It's going to be even worse if the left knows that one of its liberal justices is going to get replaced with conservative. I don't think we've seen anything yet as bad as it's going to be when that happens.
Well, certainly the cult of Ruth Bader Ginsburg with the documentary about her life, RBG, and that has certainly gone on. But she has now gone on record saying she's going to, hold on until 2020. But what if her health gets so dramatically bad? I think it was a story arc in The West Wing where the Chief Justice was in a coma, and they were trying to get him to resign, but he kept coming in and out of his. What if Ruth Bader Ginsburg's health becomes so bad that she can't continue as a justice, but won't resign it because it would give Trump the opportunity to replace a liberal lion?
That would be a real problem, and it could possibly create a constitutional crisis like we haven't seen before.
It's a scary time because there are still more and more voices saying the Constitution doesn't work anymore, Hans. And I think it's based on the fact that we haven't actually tried to govern under the Constitution in a while either. How do we reach the millennials, the young people who are listening to Taylor Swift and these folks going out saying just vote for feeling good and vote for caring for other people, which are all noble things. We want to care for each other, but just voting for the right or the left party doesn't mean you've cared for somebody. Talk about, just before we finish up, reaching that message to the millennials, or do you think that they're seeing it in some of the lunacy that's going around them?
I actually think they're seeing it in the lunacy around them, particularly those coming out of college campuses where they see that they've been taught to be afraid to speak up if they disagree with the political orthodoxy on campuses. And I don't think they like that. And I think as they go out into the world and they get jobs and they start having to pay taxes, and they look at their paycheck and say, why is so much money being taken out of my paycheck? I actually think you're going to see them voting more conservatively than people expect.
I do share your thoughts, mainly because a lot of the millennials I know have seen it come back around and roost upon them, where they were all part of the the protest culture until that protest culture circled back around and caught them up in it as well. So I guess maybe you just hope that they overplay their hand this many times that we can make the case. I do appreciate your thoughts on this, Hans. Thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Thanks for having me. And we'll be right back with more Freedom and Prosperity Radio next from the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Freedom and Prosperity Radio from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Jennifer Huddleston Skees, who works in, one of those places that I guess, your sense is always that there's got to be some intersection, and you hear economic development and the new economies and all of the technology news that you come across. Jennifer actually is there making sense of it all for us. No pressure, though, Jennifer. Welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me today, Joe.
Not at all. Now, how is it, which came first, the chicken or the egg, as it were? Certainly the new emerging technologies and the technological infrastructure. Was that your interest first, and then you came to see how, the administrative state, as you put it, interacts with it, or what direction did you approach this particularly unique field that you work in, the intersection of government and technology?
That's a great question. I'm a lawyer by training, and one of the things that I've started to notice is how much technology is impacting all of these things that we thought were kind of settled matters. Things like, what does it mean to be a driver of a car? Is your cell phone transmitting your location, and is that private information or public information? So looking at how we're seeing a kind of fundamental change as we enter the 21st century economy that is much more digital and much more connected to a lot of these elements of the administrative state and even our common law that we've thought have been settled for a century now.
Now, is it a matter where people, try to manipulate this for, whatever their purposes may be? Because I am teased, though I am probably the most technologically advanced 50-something I know, but I'm teased often for being a Luddite because I'll often look at the Fourth Amendment and say, well, it says things, items, so I would tend to think that a computer hard drive is covered under the Fourth Amendment, even though they didn't exist at the time. But I see your point. Where is public domain? I kid people on Facebook. You may think you're in your dining room, but you're really sitting on your front lawn where everyone can see you. Is that the kind of nuance that you bring to the legal practice?
Well, I'm certainly looking at some of those questions. I've written before on some of the really exciting court cases that we start to see try and settle some of those questions, cases like Carpenter that came out last spring regarding the question of cell phone location data. But mainly right now I'm looking at the interaction of the administrative state and particularly this element of soft law. So how when the administrative state and when legislatures know that they cannot possibly legislate as quickly as technology evolves, but that at the same time, in some cases, we need an element of certainty in the law for technology to really get out there and get into consumers' hands. How are they bridging that gap and using things like guidance documents or sandboxing where they invite innovators in to talk to them about what they might need in place to be able to launch an innovation in a state or even somewhere more nationally or in a local government? And also, how are we seeing innovators be a bit evasive and looking at these gray areas to find a way that they can try and solve a problem that consumers have and provide them with a solution and go forward and then have the consumers be their advocates?
Well, and you mentioned gray areas, and I certainly hear the phrase infrastructure a lot when it comes to technology, and I understand that certainly an electrical grid and moreover than that, high-speed broadband is a big part of what some of these companies look for. Is almost the same way someone would think of water supply in a sewer system 200 years ago. Is that also what you're seeing?
Well, with infrastructure, it's really interesting because a lot of the early phases of things like autonomous vehicles aren't necessarily needing new infrastructure. It's able to interact with a lot of our existing road infrastructure. When they're asking for things like wider painted, clearly visible lines on the road, which would benefit a lot of human drivers as well.
Yeah, true.
If anything, one of the things we want is for states and cities to take a technology-neutral approach because we don't necessarily know where these technologies are going to be in 5 years, 10 years, or even next week in some cases.
Well, and also there's always that inclination, and bless their little hearts, those in elected positions and even bureaucratic positions, to pick winners and losers is always a dangerous Pandora's box to open, isn't it, Jennifer?
Yes, I mean, we definitely don't want to see a sense of this is the way that we know this technology needs to evolve. And one of the benefits that a lot of states have taken as an approach, and that we are even seeing parts of the administrative state on a federal level take as an approach, is by using this soft law, they're much more able to be adaptive. They seem to be much more willing to work with innovators in a lot of ways to kind of meet in the middle and work in a way that benefits citizens the best by getting them the technology, but at the same time providing that element of safety and reassurance. I certainly understand that for a lot of people, something like a driverless car may seem a little overwhelming and scary. And so by establishing some guardrails, so to speak, for how we see this technology evolving, but allowing the testing where individual citizens can get more comfortable with it, we've seen states like Arizona take a real leadership role.
Explain the phrase soft law, because I know that my interpretation of it is probably as far off the base as it could possibly be. But explain what you mean when you say soft law.
Sure. So in some ways it's easiest to explain what soft law is by explaining what it's not. And that is that it's not hard law. It's not formal legislation. It's not formal administrative rulemaking that you would see from Congress or a state legislature or even an administrative agency. It's all those in-betweens that say things like, we encourage innovators to consider X, or we think you should do Y, but at the same time, not necessarily formally enforcing a set of principles. It's also seen when we see things like sandboxing or working groups where a state may establish certain guidelines. We've seen this with Pennsylvania's Department of Transportation that signal a willingness to innovators to provide the guidance that will give a certainty to test and develop their products, but at the same time also giving them almost an invitation to discuss these guidelines to make sure that they aren't locked into a certain future format.
I saw some very interesting tech, and you brought up driverless cars and Department of Transportation just there, and it reminded me of something I saw at the Consumer Electronics Show this past January, and we go out there every year just to see what's out there. And it was a huge setup, and I'm tempted to say it was Peterbilt, but it was one of the big truck manufacturers, and it looked like the cockpit of a truck. But it was computer monitor screens all around what would ostensibly be the computer, and it was driving a tractor trailer in the parking lot of the convention center. And what the point of it was that instead of having a driver that has to stop every 8 hours for some sleep, and you're limited to how long you can drive, with the driver's position being static and in one location, number one, the drivers liked it better because they had a home life and they had a 9-to-5 job. But the trucks actually were more productive because all you would have to do is pull over for the 2 or 3 minutes to switch drivers. The new driver would get in at the same location the old driver just got out of, and pick up and continue to drive, increasing the amount of time the truck was being productive. Is that the kind of technology you're talking about, and laws making sure that there's some regulation over that? Because my first thought was, okay, there's an 18-wheeler on the road with no driver in it, and how do I know that the Wi-Fi is connected to it and that kind of thing?
Well, I think that's why a lot of citizens want want some level of regulation over these autonomous vehicles. We've actually seen over 29 states enact either some form of legislation or an executive order giving some degree of permission to start testing autonomous vehicles, or something like platooning in some cases where a single driver may be driving several trucks where they're all kind of linked by this Wi-Fi system.
Wow.
So it's one of those things of that's definitely an area that we're seeing a lot of state action, and an area where we're seeing a lot of development, and we're seeing this approach of really allowing there to be some testing because the need is so great and the benefits are so potentially high. 94% of automobile accidents are caused by human error. So if you allow this new system to potentially reduce that, you're going to see a huge reduction in the number of accidents and a huge increase in the number of lives saved by this technology.
Jennifer Huddleston Skees is research fellow with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and we're talking about technology and the law and government and where it all sort of interacts, basically for the first time I've ever thought about it, on your desk, it seems, Jennifer. But that thought, let me take it the other direction, though, and we hear a lot of municipal, especially where there's troubled economies, whether it be a Danville or you pick the troubled or downtrodden economic landscape. People will talk about incubators or we need a new economy for the new century, and sometimes that's political rhetoric. But talk about things municipally you can do to be again, an overused word, but an incubator for that kind of technology that you see in some places like Silicon Valley.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to note that, as I've said, states and cities have an important role to play in technology policy. And we've seen, because they can be more nimble and have less bureaucratic red tape at times, that they can actually promote the innovation faster than state or federal government could. Now, you always have bad examples. For example, San Francisco tried to establish some additional regulations on top of California's already existing regulations regarding autonomous vehicles. At the same time, you had Pittsburgh establishing a way for autonomous vehicles to be tested in that city prior to Pennsylvania passing its framework for autonomous vehicles. So cities can certainly go either way by either providing more restrictions or less restrictions. I think an important thing to keep in mind is that it's not necessarily about setting up, an incubator center or an entrepreneurship zone. It's about basic things in a lot of ways, like examining the bureaucratic red tape that may be necessary to open a business in your city, to examining, are there existing things in the way that our DMV code operates that's going to prevent people from operating autonomous vehicles? Do we need to come out and clarify that, no, autonomous vehicles are welcome to be tested in our city? And for other things like fintech or various other online transactions, looking at things like occupational licensure of, is there something in our existing licensing laws that would prevent someone from being able to do this here?
Is there also so much of this is fragmented and is not just entrepreneurial, but even corporations that work in app development or those high-tech fields often are decentralized. It's network connections. It's so-and-so's in Charlottesville and his coworker is in Roanoke or somebody's in San Francisco, wherever it may be. And that networking is also important to understand that the downtown area of the 20th century may not be as applicable to the technology futures of the 21st century.
Right, and I think it's important that we don't get locked into the idea that cities need to always exist in the form that we have them. It may be that the city of the future is a bunch of people in downtown using scooters to get from point A to point B, and then people in the suburbs that are commuting in by autonomous vehicle, and people even further out that are commuting in by what we call eVTOL, which is electric vertical takeoff and landing devices, which are basically flying cars in some ways. At the same time, because of the growth of a lot of this technology that allows video chatting and remote work and document sharing, we are seeing this change of it may be that people are not quite as locked into one location as they were in the past.
Yeah, commuting as a rule is almost done in a lot of cases as well, and we see that being dealt with as well, and then the municipal response to it. So in your work, as you look at the law and the government and the technology, are there any interesting things that you've seen that are out there on the horizon, Jennifer, that would really fascinate or pique the curiosity of our listener who might say, "Oh, I didn't even think of that." What kind of cutting edge, I guess the cool kids call it bleeding edge stuff that's out there that we haven't heard of yet, that is just bubbling under the surface that we could be ready for?
I think what's interesting is a lot of things are already here in some form, and we're just going to see them becoming more and more commonplace. So if you think about it, I was in college when the iPhone came out, and I remember thinking it was so cool that you could use your phone to get from point A to point B, and now, less than 10 years later, I can't even imagine how I would survive without that kind of technology. So one of the things to realize is that while something may seem bleeding edge or really innovative now, we are more and more rapidly adapting to these new technologies. So certainly autonomous vehicles, which are being tested out in Phoenix and Tucson by Waymo, are definitely one of the things that I'm really excited about to see go more widespread. But there's also some interesting questions there, like how does car insurance change when it's an autonomous vehicle as opposed to a driver? What does it look like when we have to answer some of these difficult questions about liability that have already been rather settled in our kind of modern car-driven age? Another area that I think is really interesting is looking at how cities may change and may be able to embrace these new technologies. So looking at things like the scooters that have popped up in several cities already, and what that tells us about the future of transportation. How are cities and innovators going to look to solve this last mile problem?
I know that a lot of our listeners hear, about the soft law, and I appreciate you explaining it earlier because, sometimes we worry about governmental mandates or even encouragements leaving a lot of broad brushstroke spaces for things to go awry and for a regulatory state to go beyond what their scope should be. Case in point, an EPA saying, hey, we just want clean water, go figure out the way to do it. And then the EPA, the unelected officials are making the law. But that's not what you're talking about here, in so much as it's just being flexible enough to deal with emerging technologies as they come about.
Right, and there's certainly always a concern that it could go awry. That being said, one of the advantages of it is that it is flexible. And with technology, in some cases, it's all we have. Now, sometimes we can survive without it, but a lot of times, particularly with investors that may be a little more risk averse, or with innovators who are concerned about developing a product only to have it be declared illegal the next day, having at least that slight degree of certainty that kind of gives permission to go out and test can certainly be a good use of soft law.
Well, I know that here, I've gone in the 11 years that we've been producing this program from where, an on-location broadcast required all sorts of gear through ISDN lines off of transmission. Now my smartphone, thanks to Mixler and IK Multimedia, is a broadcast unit in the breast pocket of my jacket. So it's an amazing time to see this stuff. And I think some of that you're going to find challenges to what are broadcast rights, what is a broadcast, what is a publication, and these are some of the things that we're still struggling with. What is a publication? What is the press, as the Bill of Rights defines it, and that kind of thing. Is anything in that coming across your desk as well?
Right. So I work somewhat on an issue called Section 230. Section 230 is the law that was designed to kind of allow Internet intermediaries, things like Facebook and Twitter, and even, your own blog that may have a comment section, to really allow kind of a community to form and to submit comments without the person running that website being directly liable for what somebody may use your website to say.
Right.
So one of the things that we've been seeing are some challenges and some questions raised about whether or not this law needs to evolve as we've seen kind of changes in the media, and as we've seen things like social media evolve to a new state. The problem is the only way we got our current social media, or one of the main reasons we got our current Internet as we have it, was that we had this liability protection that allowed people to think creatively and create these communities that could then set their own rules and norms to allow individuals to interact as they saw fit.
Well, yeah, and I think it is one of those tightropes we're walking right now. Like, what is a publication? What is the responsibility of somebody that might be benefiting from the advertising of a Facebook or a Google Plus or a YouTube channel versus a Time magazine, or somebody who actually has to bear the responsibility of libelous statements being made in there. And I certainly see that being a very fascinating part of what you do, Jennifer. Is there a light at the end of that tunnel for I don't want to say fake news, but just understanding that if somebody publishes something that there's a reasonable expectation that they know wasn't true online, that there can be some responsibility brought to it?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between the person who wrote the article and the place like Facebook or Twitter that may be carrying the article. Okay. The concern is if you start making a platform liable for everything that's posted, you're going to see a lot more stringent clampdowns on online free speech, because the choice is going to be to either allow a Wild West with no moderation whatsoever, or to have really stringent guidelines because you're constantly worried about making a bad call or letting something slip through the cracks. So I think that actually the Section 230 rule that we have right now just needs to be better understood in some ways by the public. If you as an individual publish something false, there's nothing that says that you as an individual can't be held responsible for that. The way the current system works is it says if you publish something and you used Facebook to publish that, just because you used Facebook doesn't mean that you can hold Facebook liable for it.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So it really actually democratizes it more and puts it in the hand of the author of whatever is being printed, as it were, the pamphleteer, as it were, there. Unfortunately, the clock is telling me we're out of time. Jennifer Huddleston Skees at the Mercatus Center. I've really enjoyed this talk because there's a Pandora's box full of other things I could ask you about off of pretty much every little bit that we've covered here. But I do appreciate your time this week here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Joe, and I'm happy to talk anytime.
Well, you can find her at mercatus.org. There's some great columns there, gray areas and soft law, all of it. You can read more about it there online. Thank you on behalf of all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.